The rain fell in icy sheets across the Thornfield estate, obscuring the view of anyone who might have looked toward the old oak forest where a hunting party had ventured earlier that day. It was amidst this dreary November backdrop that chaos erupted. Servants rushing across muddy grounds, physicians summoned with urgent messages and hushed whispers spreading like wildfire through the grand manor. The Duke of Thornfield, Lord Alexander Blackwood, had suffered a catastrophic fall from his prized stallion during the morning fox hunt. As Eleanor Winters, daughter of a once-renowned naturalist and current companion to the household, observed the commotion from the library window, something stirred within her that few would have recognized. The keen, analytical mind her father had cultivated before his passing, and society had subsequently dismissed. It wasn't merely the accident that captured her attention, but rather the strange dissonance in the stories being hastily circulated by Lord Thomas Harrington and his elegant sister, Lady Victoria, who had both returned from the hunt with clothes suspiciously clean for such treacherous conditions. The Duke's fall was unfortunate, but hardly surprising according to the whispers that travelled through servants' quarters and drawing rooms alike. His reputation for cold arrogance and reckless horsemanship preceded him in all social circles, a character so seemingly opposite to the warm, scientific home where Eleanor had been raised. Yet as servants scrambled to prepare chambers for the injured nobleman, Eleanor found herself volunteered by Mrs. Pembroke, the kindly housekeeper, to assist with the Duke's care, a duty that caused Lady Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows to arch with undisguised contempt. The beautiful blonde aristocrat had made no secret of her intentions toward the wealthy Duke, despite his notorious emotional unavailability, following some unspoken tragedy years before. Eleanor, with her plain muslin dresses and quiet demeanor, was clearly no threat to Victoria's ambitions, merely a convenient pair of hands to manage unpleasant nursing duties while the lady maintained her immaculate appearance. With rain continuing its relentless assault, Eleanor was tasked with retrieving the Duke's personal items from where the accident occurred, guided by a reluctant stable boy who had been present when they brought the unconscious nobleman back to the estate. The muddy path through the forest seemed to whisper secrets as Eleanor carefully made her way to the clearing where the Duke had fallen. It was there, shielded from prying eyes by a curtain of rain and ancient oak trees, that Eleanor's trained naturalist's eye noticed what others had missed or deliberately ignored, a peculiar pattern of footprints in the mud that told a story entirely different from the official account of a horse spooked by thunder and a rider thrown in the ensuing chaos. The tracks showed not panic but precision, a horse that had been deliberately startled, additional human prints where none should have been, and most damning, the distinct impression of a riding crop striking the ground near where the Duke had fallen. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. This was no accident. Someone had wanted the powerful Duke of Thornfield gravely injured, perhaps even dead. With trembling hands but resolute heart, she gathered the Duke's scattered belongings, including a mysterious letter half buried in mud, its seal broken and contents partially visible, a threat unmistakable even in its water-damaged state. Eleanor's world, already precarious as an impoverished gentlewoman dependent on the charity of distant relations for her position, now tilted on an even more dangerous axis. Knowledge, her father had always taught her, carried responsibility, yet this knowledge could prove fatal if shared with the wrong ears. The Harringtons were powerful, their connections stretching throughout London society like an invisible web. Colonel James Thornton, the Duke's supposed closest friend, had been suspiciously absent from the hunting party, despite his scheduled attendance. As Eleanor carefully made her way back to the manor, the evidence of attempted murder concealed within her rain-soaked cloak, she could not have known how this discovery would intertwine her fate with that of the unconscious nobleman fighting for his life within the manor's walls. In the Duke's grand bedchamber, physicians shook their heads gravely as they tended to his battered body. The fall had left him with a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a deep wound across his temple that bled stubbornly despite their best efforts. As Eleanor slipped quietly into the room, the doctors were delivering their prognosis to the assembled household. Lord Alexander Blackwood, the formidable Duke of Thornfield, might never wake again, news received with appropriately somber expressions by all present, though Eleanor could not help but notice the almost imperceptible exchange of glances between Thomas Harrington and the family solicitor hovering near the door. Whatever conspiracy had been set in motion on those muddy paths was advancing toward its desired conclusion with each laboured breath the Duke took. The sombre task of nursing the unconscious Duke fell primarily to Eleanor, a duty that few envied, yet perfectly aligned with Lady Victoria's schemes. In the quiet hours of watching over his laboured breathing, Eleanor's mind often wandered to the path that had led her to Thornfield. 3 years prior, following her father's death and the discovery of his substantial debts, Eleanor had been forced to abandon her dreams of continuing his scientific work. Her distant cousin, Mrs. Pembroke, had secured her this position through connections that were never fully explained, transforming the daughter of a respected academic into little more than a glorified servant. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that her father's passion for observing natural phenomena had prepared her for this moment. Recognizing the unnatural pattern of hoofprints and footprints that others had either missed or deliberately ignored. Those same observational skills now allowed her to notice the slight discoloration on the Duke's silver teacup, when Lady Victoria personally delivered an herbal tonic for his recovery, a gesture Eleanor quietly thwarted by emptying the suspicious liquid into a potted plant which withered noticeably by morning. As days passed in the sick room, Eleanor developed a routine of reading scientific journals aloud to the unconscious nobleman, a practice that scandalized Lady Victoria, but was permitted by the physicians who believed familiar sounds might stir the patient's awareness. What began as Eleanor's small rebellion, choosing material that interested her rather than the religious texts Lady Victoria suggested, evolved into something unexpected when the Duke's fingers twitched at the mention of geological formations, and later when his breathing pattern changed during descriptions of exotic bird migrations. Though still unconscious, Lord Alexander seemed to be listening, forming Eleanor's first connection with the man rather than the fearsome reputation that preceded him. Through hushed conversations with the manor's older servants, Eleanor pieced together fragments of Alexander's past, his brilliant education at Oxford, his passionate interest in natural sciences before assuming his title, and most significantly, the tragic death of his young wife and unborn child 6 years prior, after which he had transformed from an engaged, curious scholar into the cold, distant figure known throughout society. Outside the sick room, the household dynamics shifted perceptibly around Eleanor. Mrs. Pembroke increased her protective presence, often finding reasons to check on the Duke's care when the Harringtons were present. Colonel Thornton, having finally arrived 3 days after the accident, watched Eleanor with an unsettling intensity that made her keep the damning, muddy letter hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her modest quarters. Most troubling was Lord Thomas's sudden interest in her background, questioning servants about her father's work and her education in a manner that suggested not romantic interest but strategic assessment of a potential threat. Each night, Eleanor meticulously documented her observations in a small journal coded with the taxonomic classifications her father had taught her, creating a record that would appear as nothing more than scientific notations to uninformed eyes. On the 7th day, during a rare moment when Eleanor found herself alone with the injured Duke, the first true breakthrough occurred. While adjusting his pillows, she spoke freely of her suspicions regarding the accident, thinking him still lost to consciousness. The pattern of disturbance in the soil suggests deliberate human intervention, not a startled horse's reaction, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The shock that coursed through her when his eyes suddenly opened, clear and alert despite days of unconsciousness, nearly caused her to drop the water basin she was carrying. Those eyes, intensely blue and sharply intelligent, fixed on her with such penetrating awareness that Eleanor knew instantly 2 critical facts. The Duke of Thornfield had heard and understood her words, and the game of life and death being played throughout the manor had just become infinitely more dangerous. The powerful nobleman said nothing, as Eleanor stammered an explanation of who she was and how long he had been unconscious, but his gaze never left her face. When footsteps approached in the hallway, Alexander Blackwood made a swift gesture for silence before closing his eyes once more, returning to the appearance of unconsciousness just as Lady Victoria swept into the room. In that brief electric moment of shared conspiracy, something fundamental shifted between them. The invisible daughter of a disgraced naturalist and one of England's most powerful peers had formed an alliance against unseen enemies, connected by muddy footprints and the understanding that public knowledge of his awakening might well seal both their fates. A delicate dance of deception began that very night, with Eleanor and the Duke establishing a secret language of their own. When others were present, he remained the unconscious invalid. When they were alone, his sharp mind engaged hers with an intensity that both terrified and exhilarated her. "They believe I remain at death's door," he whispered, during their first true conversation, his aristocratic voice roughened by disuse. "We must maintain that illusion while we uncover who orchestrated this attack." Eleanor shared her discoveries, the footprints, the suspicious circumstances, the withered plant that had received Lady Victoria's tonic, observations that drew not dismissal from the Duke, but a respectful analytical response that reminded her painfully of discussions with her father. Alexander Blackwood was not the arrogant, cold-hearted tyrant of gossip, but rather a calculating mind, assessing threats with the same precision she had witnessed him apply to the geological formations in the scientific journals. When Eleanor hesitantly revealed the half-destroyed letter she had found near the accident site, the Duke's face hardened into a mask of controlled fury that confirmed her worst suspicions. This was indeed attempted murder, not a mere riding accident. As days passed, Eleanor played her role flawlessly, appearing the dutiful nurse while serving as the Duke's eyes and ears throughout the manor. She noted the increasing frequency of hushed meetings between Lord Thomas, Lady Victoria, and the family solicitor, Mr. Graves, who seemed unusually interested in the Duke's will and inheritance laws. More concerning were the whispers that reached her from the servants about Colonel Thornton's midnight excursions to the stable where the Duke's spooked horse was kept, and the mysterious visitors arriving after dark, their conversations with Lord Thomas held in the remote West Wing. Eleanor documented everything in her coded journal, unaware that her diligent attention had not gone entirely unnoticed. Small signs, her desk subtly disturbed, her personal items rearranged, the stable boy who had accompanied her to the accident site suddenly sent to a distant property, suggested someone had become suspicious of the quiet companion with observant eyes. The Duke's physical recovery progressed steadily under Eleanor's care, though only the two of them knew the true extent of his improvement. Alexander began to test his strength in secret, performing exercises when the household believed him asleep, preparing for what both recognized would eventually require physical confrontation. During these private sessions, their conversations inevitably deepened beyond the conspiracy at hand. Eleanor found herself sharing stories of expeditions with her father, of cataloguing butterfly species in rural Hampshire and analyzing soil samples from across England. To her surprise, the Duke responded not with condescension, but with genuine interest and occasional wry humor, revealing a passion for natural sciences that mirrored her own. "Before I was forced to become this title," he confessed during one midnight conversation, his voice low and intimate in the candlelit chamber, "I had planned expeditions to document geological formations across the continent. The duchy was never meant to be mine until my brother's death." This glimpse of the man beneath the aristocratic mask created a dangerous warmth in Eleanor's chest that she dared not examine too closely. Lady Victoria's patience with Eleanor's constant presence in the sick room began to wear visibly thin as the second week of the Duke's unconsciousness progressed. What had initially been a convenient arrangement that kept the lady's hands clean of nursing duties now represented an obstacle to private access to the vulnerable nobleman. "Your dedication to His Grace is admirable," Victoria remarked one afternoon, her smile not reaching her calculating eyes, "but surely a woman of your background must find these scientific journals tedious reading material for an invalid. Perhaps prayer books would be more appropriate for both the Duke's recovery and your station." The thinly veiled insult was accompanied by a new directive. Eleanor would now be relieved of her nursing duties each evening, with Victoria herself taking the night watch. This development forced Alexander and Eleanor to accelerate their plans, knowing that Victoria's private access to the unconscious Duke presented immediate danger to his life. The catalyst came in the form of an unexpected ally, Mrs. Pembroke, who had observed more than anyone suspected from her position as housekeeper. Slipping into the Duke's chamber just before dawn, she revealed to the startled Eleanor that she had not secured this position by coincidence, but at the request of the late Duke himself, who had been a patron of Eleanor's father. "Your father saved the old Duke's life with his knowledge of medicinal plants," she explained hurriedly. "I was placed here to watch over you, but I fear I've failed in that duty. Lord Thomas has been inquiring about your father's journals and research. They suspect you know something. This revelation confirmed what Eleanor and Alexander had already begun to piece together. The attempt on the Duke's life was connected not merely to his wealth and title, but to something from the past, something potentially documented in her father's extensive records of England's most powerful families and their lands. The tangled web of science, nobility, and lethal ambition was drawing tighter, with Eleanor and the recovering Duke at its center. With Mrs. Pembroke's revelation hanging heavy in the air, Eleanor and Alexander intensified their nighttime strategy sessions, now joined by the loyal housekeeper, who provided crucial intelligence about the movements within the manor. Through whispered conversations and hastily scrawled notes, they learned that Lord Thomas had dispatched riders to Eleanor's former home, presumably searching for her father's research materials. The Harringtons' plot, it seemed, extended far beyond a simple land grab or title acquisition. There was something on Thornfield property that they desperately wanted, something potentially documented in her father's extensive geological surveys of noble estates. Alexander's face grew increasingly troubled as connections emerged between Eleanor's father's sudden financial ruin, his own brother's unexpected death 6 years prior, and the current attempt on his life. "Your father was investigating something on the northern borders of Thornfield," Alexander murmured one night, his voice strained with suppressed emotion. "The same area where my wife was thrown from her horse and killed." The implication hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. These were not separate tragedies but connected events orchestrated by the same hidden hand. As Lady Victoria assumed evening nursing duties, Alexander was forced to maintain his pretense of unconsciousness through increasingly invasive examinations and one-sided conversations that revealed more about the Harringtons' plans than Victoria intended. The beautiful blonde aristocrat spoke freely to her supposedly comatose target, detailing how she would redecorate Thornfield once they were married, how the northern lands would be sold to fund her London season, and most alarmingly, how Colonel Thornton had assured her the Duke would either die from his injuries or be declared mentally incompetent from brain damage, leaving her as his fiancée, a status she had apparently invented, in contra of his vast fortune. Each night, when Eleanor returned to resume her duties, Alexander would recount these monologues with increasing alarm, his hands clenching the bedsheets as he realized how thoroughly he had been targeted by those he had considered, if not friends, at least respectable members of his social circle. On the 18th night after the accident, a fierce storm battered Thornfield Manor, its lightning illuminating the Gothic architecture in stark, momentary tableau. Eleanor arrived for her shift to find Alexander sitting upright for the first time, his tall frame silhouetted against the window as thunder crashed outside. Without turning, he spoke in a voice so laden with emotion that Eleanor barely recognized it as belonging to the controlled nobleman. "They killed my Catherine because she discovered the coal seams beneath the northern property," he said, each word precise despite the undercurrent of rage. Coal that would have funded schools and hospitals across the county rather than filling the Harringtons' coffers. Eleanor stood frozen as Alexander turned to face her, his aristocratic features transformed by grief and fury long suppressed. "Your father found the same deposits, documented them, and paid with his reputation and ultimately his life. The accident that claimed my wife and unborn child was arranged just as mine was, but this time they failed." In the flickering candlelight, tears streaked down the Duke's face, not the tears of a broken man, but of one whose protective ice had finally melted to reveal the burning purpose beneath. The confession unleashed something between them, a torrent of shared pain and purpose that collapsed the remaining barriers of class and circumstance. Alexander described his withdrawal from society after Catherine's death, his deliberate cultivation of a cold, unapproachable persona to disguise his private investigation into her demise. Eleanor revealed her own path of quiet observation. the skills honed through years of scientific training now applied to human subjects with equally methodical precision. Their hands met across the bedsheet, a touch that acknowledged their unlikely alliance had transformed into something neither had anticipated nor sought. "You see the world as she did," Alexander whispered, vulnerability naked in his voice. "Not as society dictates it should be, but as it truly is, patterns and evidence, cause and effect." His fingers tightened around hers as he made a declaration that changed everything. "When this is finished, whatever becomes of me, I will restore your father's reputation and ensure his work benefits those it was meant to help. This I swear, not as the Duke of Thornfield, but as the man I was before this title consumed me." Eleanor's scientific mind categorized the physiological changes his words produced: heightened pulse, shortness of breath, a peculiar weightlessness that defied rational explanation. Yet beneath these observable phenomena lay something her father's methodical training had never prepared her for: the unmistakable recognition that she had developed feelings for Alexander Blackwood that transcended their shared quest for justice. As the storm raged outside Thornfield Manor, a different kind of tempest brewed within its walls. Two wounded souls finding unexpected sanctuary in each other, even as the conspiracy to destroy them both tightened around them. The time for hiding was drawing to a close. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of their counterattack, with the Duke of Thornfield prepared to rise from his deathbed like an avenging spirit. Whatever the outcome, Eleanor knew with scientific certainty that nothing in her carefully observed world would ever be the same again. Dawn broke over Thornfield Manor with an eerie calm that belied the storm of activity within. Alexander had emerged from his pretended unconsciousness with a stratagem worthy of his reputation for tactical brilliance, each element of their plan leveraging the Harringtons' own schemes against them. Eleanor would publicly announce signs of the Duke's recovery. Nothing dramatic, merely finger movements and altered breathing patterns that would force Lady Victoria and Lord Thomas to accelerate whatever they had planned before the Duke regained full consciousness. Meanwhile, Alexander would dispatch trusted servants with sealed letters to the magistrate and his solicitor in London, documenting both the evidence of attempted murder and the suspected coal deposits that had motivated the crimes against both his wife and Eleanor's father. The northern property, which the Harringtons so desperately coveted, would become their downfall. Mrs. Pembroke had located Eleanor's father's original geological surveys hidden within a false bottom of her traveling trunk. Maps that proved not only the existence of valuable resources, but also the methodical campaign to discredit anyone who discovered them. With trembling hands but resolute heart, Eleanor performed her role flawlessly, summoning Lady Victoria and Lord Thomas to the Duke's chamber to witness the encouraging development in his condition. The flash of naked panic that crossed Thomas's aristocratic features when the Duke's fingers twitched in apparent response to his name confirmed every suspicion. Victoria recovered more quickly, her practiced social smile sliding back into place as she declared this development most promising while her eyes calculated new dangers. Colonel Thornton, conspicuously absent from this gathering, was reportedly preparing for the upcoming autumn ball, an event traditionally hosted by the Duke that the Harringtons had determined should proceed despite the master's condition, ostensibly to maintain social obligations but clearly intended as a public statement about who now controlled Thornfield's destiny. Little did they know that this very event would become the stage for their exposure and downfall. What neither Eleanor nor Alexander had anticipated was the speed with which their enemies would move once threatened. That afternoon, while Eleanor was collecting medicinal herbs from the conservatory, she found herself suddenly alone with Lord Thomas, his handsome features arranged in an expression of concerned sympathy that did not reach his calculating eyes. "Miss Winters," he began with practiced charm, "I must express concern about your exhaustion from these nursing duties. A month of such strain cannot be good for your health. Perhaps a journey to recover would be beneficial. I have arranged transport to a most restful coastal property." The polite words barely disguised the threat beneath, and when Eleanor declined with equal politeness, Thomas's facade cracked momentarily. "I insist," he said, his fingers closing painfully around her wrist as he added in a whisper, Your father learned the cost of refusing Harrington generosity. Don't make his mistake." Only the timely arrival of Mrs. Pembroke prevented what Eleanor recognized as a barely disguised abduction attempt, but the message was unmistakable. The enemy now considered her a target as dangerous as the Duke himself. The failed attempt to remove Eleanor accelerated Alexander's timeline dramatically. That night, moving with painful determination despite his still healing injuries, the Duke summoned his most trusted servants to his chambers, revealing himself fully alert and issuing commands that would ensure both his and Eleanor's safety until the ball. The manor transformed overnight, loyal staff replacing questionable ones on critical duties, the Duke's private guard doubling security measures, and most importantly, the magistrate and Alexander's London solicitor invited to attend the upcoming ball as honoured guests, rather than officials conducting an investigation. Eleanor found herself moved to a chamber adjacent to the Duke's own, a scandal in normal circumstances, but justified as necessary for his medical care. What no one outside their small circle of conspirators knew was that this proximity allowed them to continue planning through a concealed passage between their rooms, meeting in the small hours to refine their strategy while the household slept. 3 days before the autumn ball, the final piece of their puzzle fell into place, when one of Alexander's men returned from London with confirmation that Lord Thomas had secretly leveraged himself to financial ruin, with debts so extensive that only access to Thornfield's rumoured coal deposits could save the Harrington family from complete disgrace. More damning still, bank records showed substantial payments from Thomas to Colonel Thornton just before both the accident that killed the Duchess 6 years ago and Alexander's recent fall. The evidence formed a damning chain leading directly to the conspirators, yet Alexander insisted they needed more than paper proof. They needed public confession before witnesses whose social standing would make the revelation incontrovertible. "Justice must be seen," he told Eleanor during their midnight council, his hand unconsciously covering hers on the map between them. "Not just for Catherine and your father, but for you. The world will acknowledge what they tried to bury." In that moment, Eleanor finally recognized the transformation in Alexander's eyes when he looked at her, not merely respect or gratitude, but something far more dangerous and exhilarating, the unmistakable heat of admiration turning rapidly toward devotion. The night of the autumn ball arrived with all the pageantry Thornfield Manor could muster, its grand ballroom illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across elaborate floral arrangements and liveried servants. From her modest chamber, Eleanor watched the arriving carriages with a mixture of determination and dread, each vehicle disgorging members of society's elite who believed they were attending a traditional seasonal celebration rather than what Alexander had grimly termed a theatre of justice. The gown laid out on Eleanor's bed, a creation of midnight blue silk that Mrs. Pembroke had somehow procured, represented a transformation far beyond mere fabric. Tonight, the overlooked companion would step into the light as the Duke's key ally, though none of the glittering guests yet realized her significance. As Eleanor's maid arranged her dark curls with more care than they had ever received, she could not help but reflect on how thoroughly her life had changed in the month since she'd first noticed those damning footprints in the mud, from invisible servant to central figure in a drama of attempted murder, hidden fortunes, and unexpected affection from one of England's most powerful men. The collective gasp that greeted the Duke of Thornfield's entrance to his own ballroom was precisely the reaction Alexander had orchestrated. Leaning slightly on an ebony cane but otherwise showing remarkable recovery, he descended the grand staircase with measured steps, his commanding presence amplified by the dramatic black evening attire that made him appear more avenging angel than convalescent. Helena, entering separately and unnoticed as planned, observed the tableau from the periphery, Lady Victoria's face draining of colour beneath her rouge, Lord Thomas's champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, and Colonel Thornton's hand moving instinctively toward where a weapon might be concealed. The whispers spread like wildfire through the assembly. The Duke had not only awakened but appeared in full possession of his faculties, a development that clearly terrorized those who had planned otherwise. When Alexander began greeting guests with practiced charm, moving purposefully through the crowd toward the orchestra dais, Eleanor slipped through the edges of the gathering as they had rehearsed, positioning herself near the magistrate and the London solicitor who watched the proceedings with professional interest beneath their social smiles. The orchestra fell silent at a subtle gesture from Alexander, who had reached the small raised platform typically reserved for announcements of engagements or notable honors. His aristocratic voice carried effortlessly across the now hushed ballroom as he thanked his guests for attending despite his unfortunate riding accident, a phrase delivered with such pointed irony that several observers exchanged uncomfortable glances. With calculated precision, Alexander recounted his miraculous recovery, attributing it to the exceptional care of one particular member of his household, at which point his piercing gaze found Eleanor in the crowd, his extended hand an unmistakable summons that sent ripples of confusion through the assembly. The journey across that ballroom floor was the longest of Eleanor's life, each step carrying her further from the shadows of her previous existence and into the brilliant, dangerous light of public scrutiny. The whispers intensified as recognition dawned. The plain companion in unexpected finery, approaching the Duke with a composure that belied her racing heart, accepting his outstretched hand with a grace that reflected months of watching aristocratic behavior rather than experiencing it. Alexander's public acknowledgement of Eleanor's role in his recovery constituted only the opening gambit in their carefully orchestrated evening. Standing beside her on the platform, his hand maintaining its supportive grasp on hers, he smoothly transitioned to what appeared to be a property announcement regarding the northern lands, precisely the topic the Harringtons had most feared. As Alexander spoke of geological surveys and untapped resources that would benefit the counties less fortunate, Eleanor watched Lord Thomas attempting to retreat toward the exits, only to find his path subtly blocked by footmen positioned precisely for this purpose. The trap was closing, inch by meticulous inch, as Alexander called forward his special guests. The magistrate, the solicitor, and finally, with devastating effect, the stable boy who had accompanied Eleanor to the accident site now returned from his supposed reassignment and prepared to testify about the bribe Lord Thomas had paid him to remain silent about what he had witnessed in the forest that rainy morning. The ballroom's atmosphere transformed from confusion to scandal as Alexander methodically presented evidence of the conspiracy. Financial records projected onto screens through innovative magic lantern technology, the recovered letter found in the mud with its explicit threat, and most damning of all, a sworn affidavit from Colonel Thornton's valet detailing his master's instructions regarding the sabotage of the Duke's saddle. Throughout the devastating presentation, Alexander maintained his position beside Eleanor, their physical proximity making a statement as powerful as the evidence itself. When Lady Victoria attempted a desperate counterattack, suggesting that brain injury had left the Duke delusional and under the inappropriate influence of a social climbing servant, Alexander executed the most shocking move of the evening, not by defending Eleanor's honor with mere words, but by turning to her before the entire assembly, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture of unmistakable devotion, and announcing that Miss Eleanor Winters had agreed to become the next Duchess of Thornfield. The collective intake of breath that followed this declaration was loud enough to momentarily drown out the orchestra's attempt to resume playing, as one of England's most powerful men publicly aligned himself not with wealth or status, but with the overlooked daughter of a disgraced scientist who had noticed what everyone else had missed. Footprints in mud that told a different story. The seconds that followed Alexander's declaration stretched into an eternity of silent shock before erupting into a cacophony of reactions that reflected every facet of the rigid social hierarchy being so dramatically upended. Dowagers clutched their pearl necklaces in scandalized horror. Ambitious mothers who had positioned their own daughters for the Duke's attention exchanged looks of outraged disbelief, while a small contingent of progressive thinkers and scientists who had respected Eleanor's father broke into spontaneous applause that rippled awkwardly through the crowd. Through it all, Eleanor stood with scientific detachment that belied her internal tumult, observing the social experiment unfolding around her with the same precision she had once applied to categorizing butterfly species, noting with particular interest how the magistrate's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to unmistakable approval. Lady Victoria's beautiful face contorted into something unrecognizable as she realized the full extent of her social humiliation her carefully cultivated persona cracking to reveal the naked ambition and cruelty beneath. "This is absurd!" she finally shrieked, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "The Duke clearly suffers from addled wits if he believes this. This nobody deserves the Thornfield title. She has bewitched him during his vulnerability. A calculated seduction while he was incapacitated." The accusation hung in the air like poison, precisely the desperate counterattack Alexander had anticipated and prepared for. With a calm that spoke of complete control, he signaled to his solicitor, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing sworn statements from Alexander's physicians confirming his mental competence, followed by documentation revealing how thoroughly Lady Victoria had invented their supposed engagement. As these papers circulated among key influential guests, Alexander executed the most devastating move of all, calling forward Mrs. Pembroke, who revealed her true identity not as a mere housekeeper, but as the Dowager Countess of Merewether, who had adopted her lower position specifically to protect Eleanor at the request of the late Duke after the suspicious circumstances of her father's demise. "I have watched Miss Winters demonstrate intelligence, integrity and compassion that many born to privilege never achieve," the Countess declared, her aristocratic accent now fully restored. Her father was no fraud, but a victim of the same conspiracy that nearly claimed the Duke's life. A conspiracy motivated by greed for the coal deposits he discovered beneath Thornfield's northern lands. Lord Thomas, seeing the noose of justice tightening, made a desperate lunge toward the nearest exit only to find his path blocked by the magistrate's men who had been strategically positioned throughout the ballroom. His capture was swift but undignified, his protests fading to muted threats as evidence of his financial desperation, and transactions with Colonel Thornton were read aloud to the increasingly horrified assembly. The colonel himself, ever the military strategist, attempted a different approach, a full confession offered in exchange for leniency, his cultured voice carrying across the now silent ballroom as he detailed how Thomas had masterminded both the death of the previous Duchess and the attempt on Alexander's life. It was always about the coal, he admitted with surprising candor. Thomas discovered it would be worth millions, but the Duke intended to use the profits for public works rather than selling to private interests. The accident that claimed his wife was meant to break him, to drive him to sell the northern property in his grief. When that failed, more direct measures were required. As the conspirators were removed from the ballroom in disgrace, the evening transformed into something no one had anticipated, a celebration not merely of justice served, but of social barriers transcended. Eleanor found herself surrounded by curious, admiring guests, eager to hear about her father's scientific work and her own observations that had unraveled the conspiracy. More astonishing still was watching Alexander move through the crowd with renewed purpose. The cold, distant Duke replaced by a man of passion and conviction who kept returning to her side with unmistakable pride. When the orchestra finally resumed playing, Alexander's request for Eleanor's hand in the first dance created yet another ripple of sensation through the gathering, not simply for the honor it represented, but for the genuine tenderness visible in his expression as he guided her through the steps she had only ever observed from the periphery. "You're doing magnificently," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "They're beginning to see what I see, the most remarkable woman in England." The ball continued into the early hours, transforming gradually from scandal to celebration, as society processed the evening's revelations and began adjusting to a new reality, one where a duke had chosen a naturalist's daughter based on merit rather than status, where justice had prevailed over privilege, and where the long-buried truth about Eleanor's father had finally emerged into the light. For Eleanor, the evening represented a different kind of scientific phenomenon, the observation that human hearts, like natural elements, could undergo transformations that defied all previous categorization. As dawn approached, she stood on Thornfield's terrace beside Alexander, both watching the first light touch the northern lands that had nearly cost them everything. "Those fields will fund schools teaching girls the sciences," he promised, his hand finding hers with the certainty of a natural law. "Your father's name will grace the first of them." In that moment, Eleanor understood that the greatest discovery of her scientific career had been this: that beneath the cold exterior of a man society had labeled unapproachable lay a heart of extraordinary warmth, waiting only for someone observant enough to recognize the truth hidden in plain sight, just like those fateful footprints in the mud. The weeks following the autumn ball unleashed a transformation of Thornfield and its inhabitants, as dramatic as any seasonal change Eleanor had ever documented in her nature journals. The scandal of the Harringtons' conspiracy dominated London newspapers, with each day bringing new revelations about the extent of their crimes, not only against Alexander and his late wife, but against numerous other families whose lands contained valuable resources. Eleanor's father's reputation underwent its own renaissance, as his meticulous geological surveys were published posthumously in scientific journals, validating his theories and restoring his name among England's scientific community. The cottage where Eleanor had grown up became a pilgrimage site for young scientists, while the northern fields of Thornfield, the land that had motivated so much tragedy, was officially dedicated as the future site of the Winters Academy for Scientific Education, with a particular focus on providing opportunities for women of all social classes. Most profound of all were the changes within Thornfield Manor itself, as Alexander systematically removed the gloomy draperies and somber furnishings that had reflected his years of isolated grief, replacing them with light, scientific instruments and extensive collections of natural specimens that welcomed exploration rather than imposing aristocratic intimidation. The announcement of Eleanor and Alexander's engagement sent further shockwaves through society, though the more progressive elements embraced the union as evidence of changing times. Planning for the wedding became Eleanor's first experience navigating high society as something other than an invisible observer, a transition made smoother by the unexpected support of several influential dowagers who had privately admired her composure during the dramatic ball. The Dowager Countess of Merewether, no longer masquerading as Mrs. Pembroke, took particular delight in accompanying Eleanor to modistes and tea parties, where the once overlooked companion found herself the center of both sincere admiration and calculated social maneuvering. Through it all, Eleanor maintained the scientific detachment that had served her so well, cataloguing the behavior of aristocratic society with the same precision she had once applied to flora and fauna. "You observe them as specimens," Alexander noted with amusement during a rare moment alone in the conservatory, his hand tracing the outline of a rare orchid with the same delicacy he now used when touching her face. "I find I rather enjoy watching you classify the species of the ton." The wedding itself represented the culmination of Thornfield's transformation, a celebration that honored tradition while boldly embracing a future where merit transcended birth. Eleanor walked toward her waiting duke, not in a traditional white gown, but in a shimmering creation the color of spring leaves, embroidered with scientifically accurate representations of the butterfly species she and her father had documented together. Alexander's face as she approached contained none of the coldness that had once defined him in society's eyes, but rather an open wonder that caused even the most cynical guests to glance away, uncomfortable with witnessing something so genuinely intimate. Their vows, written together during long evenings in Thornfield's newly established library, spoke not of obedience or duty, but of partnership, discovery, and the courage to see truth where others perceived only what convention dictated. When the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke of Thornfield and his new Duchess sealed their union with a kiss that represented not merely romantic affection, but the fusion of two minds that had recognized in each other something society had failed to value properly. Spring arrived at Thornfield with an explosion of new growth, both literal and metaphorical. The northern fields bustled with activity as construction began on the Winters Academy, while the manor itself hosted a steady stream of scientists, engineers, and educators collaborating on curricula that would serve students regardless of gender or social standing. Eleanor moved through her new role as Duchess with the same quiet competence she had shown as a companion, though now her observations and insights received the attention they deserved. Most evenings found her and Alexander in their private study, poring over maps, specimens, or architectural plans with equal enthusiasm, their conversations flowing between personal affection and intellectual partnership with no clear delineation between the two. I find myself wondering, Alexander mused on one such evening, as they examined a particularly interesting rock formation brought from the northern property. What would have happened had you not noticed those footprints in the mud? Would we have found each other anyway, I wonder? Eleanor's scientific mind considered the question with its typical thoroughness before responding with uncharacteristic romanticism. I believe we would. Some connections, like certain natural phenomena, seem governed by laws even stronger than those of society. The transformation of the once isolated Duke proved perhaps the most remarkable specimen in Eleanor's collection of observations. The man society had labelled cold and unapproachable now laughed openly with students visiting Thornfield's laboratories, knelt without concern for his expensive trousers to examine interesting soil samples with local children, and spoke at scientific gatherings with a passion that reminded older members of the community of his younger self, before grief and duty had encased his heart in protective ice. Most telling was how he looked at Eleanor across crowded rooms, not with the possessive pride of an aristocrat who had acquired an unusual wife, but with the wonder of a fellow explorer who had discovered an unexpected miracle. For her part, Eleanor found that her scientific training had prepared her surprisingly well for the emotional landscape of love. Observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and the courage to accept results that defied conventional explanation all proved valuable skills in navigating the complex territory of marriage to a man whose public and private selves had once been so dramatically different. Together, they were rewriting the social equations of what nobility could mean, not a matter of birth alone, but of character, intelligence, and the willingness to see what others missed. The second autumn of Eleanor and Alexander's marriage brought with it a harvest of accomplishments that extended far beyond Thornfield's fertile fields. The Winters Academy welcomed its first class of 50 students, half of them young women who would have found scientific education inaccessible just a year prior. Eleanor moved among them not as a distant patroness, but as an active instructor, her lessons on observational techniques drawing from both her father's methodologies and her own life-saving attention to detail. The irony was not lost on her that the very skills society had dismissed as inappropriate obsessions for a young woman had not only saved Alexander's life, but transformed dozens of other lives as well. The coal deposits beneath the northern fields, now ethically mined with advanced safety measures and fair wages, generated wealth that funded scholarships, laboratories, and community improvements throughout the county. When the Royal Scientific Society awarded posthumous recognition to Eleanor's father at their annual gathering, it was the Duke of Thornfield who accepted on behalf of the late naturalist his impassioned speech about overlooked genius, bringing tears to the eyes of even the most stoic academics in attendance. Private happiness matched their public success, as Eleanor and Alexander established rhythms of partnership that defied conventional aristocratic marriages. Their expedition room became Thornfield's heart, with maps covering every wall and specimens filling custom-built cabinets designed to Alexander's specifications. Here they planned travels to document geological formations across Europe, continuing the work both had abandoned through circumstance, she through financial necessity, he through the burden of unexpected title and tragedy. Society gossips who had predicted the Duke would soon tire of his unusual duchess were silenced by the obvious contentment of the couple, whose intellectual connection deepened into something even the most cynical observer recognized as extraordinary. When Eleanor's first scientific paper was published under her own name rather than a male pseudonym, Alexander hosted a celebration that brought together aristocrats and academics in unprecedented social integration, his pride in his wife's accomplishments evident in every gesture and glance. The true measure of their transformation came unexpectedly during a winter evening when Alexander received word that Lord Thomas Harrington had died in prison while awaiting trial for his numerous crimes. Where once such news might have satisfied the Duke's desire for justice, he received the information with somber reflection rather than vindication. "I find I pity him," Alexander confessed, as he and Eleanor sat before the library fire, snowflakes swirling beyond the windows. To be so consumed by greed that he would destroy lives, including ultimately his own, What a poverty of spirit that represents. Eleanor studied her husband's face, noting the compassion that had replaced the cold mask he had worn for so many years. "The greatest wealth," she replied softly, taking his hand, "is the capacity to see value where others do not, in unexplored lands, in unconventional ideas, in overlooked people." Their fingers intertwined as naturally as two complementary species sharing the same ecological niche, evidence of how thoroughly their separate paths had grown into a shared journey. Spring arrived with news that caused even Eleanor's scientific composure to falter. The confirmation from her physician that Thornfield would welcome an heir by autumn. Alexander's response to the announcement defied all aristocratic convention. Rather than the restrained satisfaction expected of a nobleman securing his lineage, he gathered his wife into an embrace of such unguarded joy that the servants witnessing it exchanged astonished glances. The Duke of Thornfield, once known throughout England for his rigid self-control, now spun his laughing duchess around their bedchamber with childlike exuberance before kneeling to press his ear against her still flat stomach, whispering promises of expeditions and discoveries awaiting this new explorer. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, Alexander transformed their home yet again, commissioning a nursery filled with miniature scientific instruments, illustrated botanical guides, and maps of both real and imaginary lands. "Our child will never be constrained by what society deems appropriate," he vowed, arranging a collection of butterfly specimens in the nursery with the same care he once reserved for estate documents. "Boy or girl, they will learn to see the world as it truly is, full of patterns waiting to be recognized by those observant enough to notice." The autumn of Eleanor's confinement found Thornfield Manor hosting an unprecedented gathering. Not the traditional male relatives awaiting news of an heir, but a collection of female scientists, educators, and physicians supporting the Duchess through her labor. Alexander paced the gallery with uncharacteristic anxiety, the last vestiges of his aristocratic reserve dissolving as his wife's labor progressed. When the first cries of their daughter filled the ancient manor halls, the Duke of Thornfield, the man once believed incapable of genuine emotion, wept openly before the assembled staff, cradling the infant with trembling hands that had once seemed permanently frozen in aristocratic detachment. "Catherine Eleanor Winters Blackwood," he announced, honoring both his first wife and the woman who had brought him back to life. As Eleanor watched her husband introducing their daughter to her first butterfly specimen, a glass-enclosed monarch positioned to catch the sunlight beside her cradle, she reflected that the greatest scientific discovery of her life had been the capacity of the human heart to transform, like a caterpillar to butterfly, when finally seen and valued for its true nature rather than its outward appearance. 5 years passed at Thornfield with the changing seasons, bringing growth both expected and surprising. Young Catherine, nicknamed Kate by her adoring parents, grew into a child who embodied the best qualities of both: Alexander's quiet determination and Eleanor's meticulous observation skills, manifesting in a girl who could identify geological formations and butterfly species with equal enthusiasm. The Winters Academy flourished beyond even Eleanor's careful projections, expanding to 3 campuses across England, with graduates already contributing to scientific journals and exploration expeditions. Most remarkable was the social transformation radiating outward from Thornfield, like ripples in a pond, other aristocratic families gradually adopting more progressive approaches to education and marriage, inspired by the unmistakable happiness and prosperity the unconventional Duke and Duchess had achieved. The annual Thornfield Scientific Exhibition became a highlight of the social season, drawing nobility and academics together in collaboration rather than separation, with Eleanor and Alexander moving between both worlds with the ease of naturalists comfortable in multiple habitats. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Eleanor and Alexander hosted a celebration that served as both social gathering and academic symposium. As twilight descended over Thornfield's gardens, elegantly dressed guests mingled among display tables featuring student research, engineering innovations, and botanical specimens. Eleanor, now recognized as one of England's leading naturalists, despite her unconventional entry into scientific circles, found herself approached by a young woman clutching a worn copy of her recently published book on observational methodologies. "Your Grace," the girl began hesitantly, her clothing marking her as a scholarship student rather than an aristocrat's daughter. "They say you were once considered invisible by society, yet you saw what everyone else missed. How did you find the courage?" Eleanor studied the girl with the same attention she might give a rare specimen, recognizing in her anxious expression the same hunger for validation she had once felt. Taking the student's hands in hers, the Duchess of Thornfield offered the truth she had discovered. Courage comes from trusting what you observe rather than what you are told to see. Society's vision is often clouded by convention, but reality leaves evidence for those patient enough to notice. Footprints in mud, patterns in nature, or value in people others have dismissed. Later that evening, as moonlight silvered Thornfield's ancient stone walls, Eleanor found Alexander in their private study, bent over architectural plans for the Academy's newest expansion. The years had added distinguished silver at his temples, but had taken nothing from the intensity of his gaze when he looked up to greet her. Rising to pour 2 glasses of champagne, he raised his in a toast that encompassed far more than their anniversary. "To the most significant discovery of my life," he said softly, "finding that what I had been trained to overlook, a quiet companion with mud on her boots, would become my greatest treasure." Eleanor accepted both the champagne and the sentiment, with the grace that had become natural to her, adding her own observation, "And to seeing beneath surfaces, whether of land hiding valuable resources, or people concealing their true nature behind social masks." Their glasses clinked in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had learned to read each other as fluently as any scientific text, partners in the truest sense of the word. As summer turned to autumn once more, bringing with it the golden light that transformed Thornfield's grounds into a canvas of warm color, Eleanor found herself standing on the exact spot where Alexander had fallen from his horse 6 years earlier. The forest path had been widened into a proper trail, now part of the Academy's nature curriculum, with markers identifying significant geological formations and botanical specimens. Catherine skipped ahead on the path, her dark curls bouncing as she carefully documented butterfly sightings in her child-sized journal, occasionally calling back observations in the precise language her parents had taught her. Alexander joined Eleanor at the historic spot, his hand finding hers with the familiarity of long practice. "It still astonishes me," he said quietly, watching their daughter examine a particularly interesting rock formation, "how a moment that was meant to end everything instead became the beginning. Had you not seen those footprints?" Eleanor smiled, completing his thought as she often did. "Had I not been considered invisible enough to speak my observations freely? Had you not been willing to listen despite our different stations? Had we both not recognized patterns others missed?" They stood in silent acknowledgement of how thoroughly their lives had been transformed by attention to details others overlooked, by valuing substance over appearance, and by the courage to trust their observations even when society dictated otherwise. Dear listener, as our tale of Eleanor and Alexander draws to a close, perhaps you find yourself wondering what treasures in your own life remain hidden in plain sight. What potential within yourself or others has been overlooked because it doesn't match conventional expectations? The world is full of Eleanors whose quiet brilliance awaits recognition, and Alexanders whose true nature may be concealed beneath protective facades created by past wounds. The most valuable discoveries often require looking beyond surfaces, whether muddy footprints revealing attempted murder or quiet companions possessing extraordinary minds. In your own journey, remember that worth is rarely determined by society's first assessment. The person others have dismissed, the opportunity that seems insignificant, the talent that doesn't fit neatly into expected categories, these may contain the greatest potential for transformation. Like our Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, you might find that your most significant discoveries come not from searching exotic locations, but from truly seeing what has been before you all along, waiting only for the courage to acknowledge its value. For the most extraordinary journeys often begin with the simplest act, noticing what everyone else has missed and recognizing that sometimes the footprints in the mud tell a completely different story than the one the world believes.